In this next episode of our Jerusalem from Genesis to Jesus series, we discover Jerusalem defeated and destroyed by the armies of Babylon, but never beyond hope. This is the city of Jerusalem, a city that has known times of incredible peace and times of terrible war. In some cases, God stepped in and saved this city from its demise, but in others, Jerusalem's enemies had the victory. We've come far in our journey through Jerusalem's biblical history, but now we have reached the tragic end of the First Temple period, a time in Jerusalem's history when all hope seemed lost for God's chosen city. A time when the inhabitants of Jerusalem are carried away as captives to Babylon, and their beloved city is no more. And as difficult as this period of history may be, there remains an undying hope that Jerusalem's children will return to her once again. Almost everywhere you go in Jerusalem, you can be sure you are walking where significant historical and biblical events took place. And while some of Jerusalem's archaeology reflects her more glorious moments, so much reminds us of the utter devastation this city has known throughout her long, tumultuous history. Leading up to one of Jerusalem's most devastating defeats, from 626 to 587 BC, the prophet Jeremiah burned with a dreaded message for the people of Jerusalem who had broken their covenant with God. And, unlike Isaiah's encouraging word to King Hezekiah, Jeremiah foresaw famine, conquest, and captivity in the immediate future. Solomon's temple was going to be destroyed. So, Hezekiah, God brings great victory without Hezekiah having to do a thing. But eventually, Israel's sin, Israel's disobedience, all these things catch up at some point, and then there is a true siege that happens when another empire comes. Talk to us about this period of history.
Well, the Babylonians are the ones who actually destroy Solomon's temple, and it's a terrible, terrible thing, a tragedy. And the first time the temple is destroyed. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of Jeremiah, for example.
Yeah.
Jeremiah chapter 7. And the way he talks to the nation, I think, gives you such an amazing sense of the mentality before the destruction. Because they're saying to him, and you have a few different places in Jeremiah where he says to them, you think the temple's going to save you. The temple's not going to save you. If you don't repair your ways and repent, this bringing sacrifices, it's not this, special voodoo kind of thing, okay, everything is fine as long as you bring your sacrifices. And he says to them, makes fun of them. You keep saying the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord is not going to save you.
Right.
So there's one place here, and he says to in that context, he says, just go to my place at Shiloh, where I had established my name formerly, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people of Israel. He's reminding them that there was once, okay, not a temple, not Jerusalem's temple, not something as permanent, but still, the tabernacle at Shiloh was a permanent building and lasted for almost 400 years.
Right.
And God destroyed it because the nation sinned. And Jeremiah is using that to say to them that the temple is not going to be here forever. It will be destroyed. Jerusalem will be destroyed if you don't repent your ways. And, of course, this parallel between the destruction of Shiloh and destruction of Jerusalem is just so vivid, and they They don't pay attention.
Right.
It doesn't help, okay? But we have that as a foreshadowing from Jeremiah before the destruction that this is really what's going to happen. And of course it does. And the book of Lamentations is written by Jeremiah. In our traditions, we believe it was written by Jeremiah in response to, he lives through the destruction of the temple. He's there, he's an eyewitness, and he is describing in Jeremiah not just incredible grief, mourning, tragedy. He describes some of the most horrific things that are happening, the starvation, the desperation of the people in Jerusalem. There's no food, there's no water, there's no leadership, and they have nowhere to turn. And so it's not just a building is destroyed, but you get the sense of a destruction of the people of Israel. Yeah. What next? Now today we have a whole different perspective. We've already been, a few thousand years after that event. We know that Judaism outlived not only one, but two temples.
Right.
And now, 2,000 years after the destruction of the second temple, here we are. But put yourselves in the place of that Jew in Judea, seeing his temple destroyed and his land overrun by Babylon, and he's thinking, this is the end of us as a people.
Right.
And it makes sense.
Yep.
Every people that the Babylonians or the Assyrians destroyed never came back.
Don't go away. When we come back, Isaac shows me archaeology that reveals a family who lived in Jerusalem until the Babylonian conquest. I was a pastor for over 20 years before I first went to Israel, only to realize that I had been totally disconnected from the roots of my faith. Since then, I've been on a journey of discovery, and my faith has come alive in ways I never could have imagined. I'm Jeff Futers, Director of First Century Foundations, and I am excited to invite you on my journey to the foundations of our faith, to discover your part in a Bible story that isn't over yet. First Century Foundations exists to reconnect Christians to the foundations of Christianity. And we do this by creating Bible-based media focused on Israel and the Jewish roots of our faith. But we don't just reconnect you to Israel's history, we help you participate in what God is doing in Israel today by connecting you to over 70 incredible ministries in Israel who desperately need our support. Will you partner with us? Together, we'll explore Israel's significant past while doing our part to ensure that Israel has a bright future. It is difficult to imagine living in Jerusalem when the Temple of Solomon was still functioning, even as war and destruction were looming thick in the air. To help me learn about this time in history, Isaac took me to a beautiful location I had never been before, just outside of Jerusalem's walls. Now, Isaac, we're here in Jerusalem, and you're going to give me a sense of why we're on this hill overlooking the city of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, from this vantage point. What are we learning here today?
So, Jeff, the green mountain that you see over there, this is Mount Zion.
Right.
By the foot of Mount Zion, further to the south, Hinnom Valley. So we are above Hinnom Valley, Katef Hinnom. We are also north of the Valley of Rephaim, which is over there. Valley of Rephaim is mentioned in the book of Joshua. Now, during the time of the first temple, this hill that you see here was one big cemetery. During the time of archaeological excavations, on top of this hill, archaeologists discovered a lot of burial caves, originally from the time of the first temple. And if you want to see some very interesting remains from Babylonians era that were found here, Katef Hinnom, please follow me, and I will show you.
Let's go.
Let's go.
So, Isaac, you've
sir.
brought me to an ancient graveyard. What in the world are we doing here?
Oh, this is a very good question. Now, over here in Katef Hinnom, archaeologists discovered some very interesting burial caves. And right now, we are standing in the middle of one of them. First of all, in archaeology, we have to use our imagination. So try to imagine that originally this place was under the ground. So this is the inside of a cave. In your imagination, imagine that this place was covered with a roof. Now, these caves that we have here are not natural caves. These are man-made artificial caves. And over here, we can see part of the cemetery of Jerusalem that belong to very rich families. Now, this specific cave where we are right now is date back in time to the very, very end of the time of the first temple until the time of Babylonians occupation, 586-87 BC. Now, what do we have here? Over here, we have a burial cave that belonged to a very rich family that lived here in Jerusalem, 6th century BC. And this is what we have here. Now, a few more words about the burial customs in those days. Please remember that the burial customs in those days, late First Temple period, took place in 2 stages. Stage 1, when someone died, then the family had to bring the body, and then they had to lay the body on this rock, on this shelf. Over here, you can see the place for the head.
Oh, okay.
So first of all, the dead bodies faced the sky. So this is where you put the head of the dead body. Here we have the shoulders, and here the rest of the body. Now you can see that this cave, as I said, belonged to a family. So over here you can put few more dead bodies. Let's say that the grandfather is the first to die, you put him here. Let's say a few months later, one of the uncles died, you put him next to the grandfather. Now, from the moment that you put the dead body, now you have to go home and to wait for 1 year. After a year, members of the family had to come back. Now, after a year that they returned back here, they found only the skeleton, no flesh.
Right.
Flesh is gone. And then this is the beginning of stage number 2. Stage 2, members of the family, they had to pick up, to collect the bones, and then they had to put the bones inside this underground cave.
Ah, okay.
So, as we say, the 2 stages. Stage 1, you put the dead body on the shelf,
Right.
you go home, wait for a year. Stage 2, you come, collect the bones and put them inside this cave. And this explains something which is mentioned many times in the Bible.
Okay.
Many times in the Bible, we can read, for example, about one of the kings of Jerusalem or Judea who died. And it is written that after a year, he was gathered with his fathers, or his bones gathered with his fathers. So now we understand better the meaning of this biblical sentence.
Wow.
Now, inside this cave, a part of the bones, we discovered a lot of interesting artifacts, very expensive artifacts,
Okay.
7th, 6th century BC. Like, for example, over here, they found some vessels made out of glass. Over here, they discovered lots of jewelries made out of gold and ivory. So this can teach us that the people who were buried here were very rich people that came from very wealthy families. But Jeff, the most important and the most fascinating discovery here in the 80s inside this cave, archaeologists discovered 2 silver scrolls. And this is a fascinating story because Professor Barkai actually said that one day one of his workers was walking inside, and all of a sudden she called him and she showed him something that she found inside that looked like 2 small cigarettes. And then they took it, they cleaned it. All of a sudden they realized that they were holding 2 ancient scrolls written on silver.
Wow.
Now, it took 3 years until they developed the technique how they could unroll the scrolls without destroying them. 3 years later, they managed to unroll these scrolls, and inside they found inscriptions in very ancient Hebrew. We are talking about the Hebrew from 7th, 6th century BC until the time of Babylonians occupation. And these are the most ancient inscriptions in Hebrew found written on scrolls. Eventually, they managed to read and to understand these writings in ancient Hebrew. We are talking about Birkat Kohanim, the blessing of the priests. Now, if we open our Bibles, if you go to the book of Numbers, chapter 6,
Right.
verses 24 to 26, we read about Birkat Kohanim, the blessing of the priests. Now, here they found 2 silver scrolls. On scroll number 1, they discover the beginning of Birkat Kohanim. Scroll number 2, the end. To be more precise, on scroll number 1, they found Numbers 6, verses 24 and beginning of 25.
Okay.
And on the other scroll, they found the end of verse 25 and verse 26. So altogether, these 2 silver scrolls give us the whole of Birkat Kohanim, the whole of the blessing of the priest, with the 3 verses from Numbers chapter 6.
Wow.
And this is, again, end of the time of the first temple until the time of Babylonians occupation. And again, we need to emphasize the point that everything here come to an end. No more burial here, no more findings here from the time of Babylonians occupation, which was a very violent act of a war
Right.
here in Jerusalem.
Right. Well, that's absolutely incredible. And to think about what some people say, you know, that there's no evidence of Jewish history in the land of Israel. Here we are, we're in Jerusalem, not very far from the walls of the old city, and 600 BC, these scrolls were written in ancient Hebrew. I don't know, you tell me.
Mind-blowing.
Mind-blowing is
And,
absolutely right.
I would even add and emphasize, it's very dramatic to think that everything here came to an end because of the Babylonians occupation. Think about it. Without Babylonian occupation, of course, more and more rich families could come here, they could continue to dig more caves, and we could find more and more caves. But everything came to an end because of this Babylonians occupation, the bitter end of Jerusalem.
Wow. Don't go away. When we come back, we hear from author and historian Ken Spiro and see evidence of Jerusalem's destruction by the armies of Babylon. Hey everybody, we have something really exciting to tell you about. My good friend Isaac has been our guide on a number of our tours, and you have seen him on our television show, First Century Foundations. Isaac, tell them what we're doing.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Shalom from Mount of Olives, Jerusalem. We have an amazing tour which has never ever been done before. We are going to cover all of the land of Israel, from Mount Hermon in the north down to the Red Sea in the south, from Mediterranean Sea in the west to the River Jordan in the east.
And here's the most amazing part. If you come on this tour, June 2024, this will be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for you to be a part of our live audience for the taping of 2 seasons of our television show, First Century Foundations. Don't miss this opportunity.
Make your next destination meaningful. Visit firstcenturyfoundations.com to find the tour that's right for you.
It was so intriguing to visit a tomb that was used by a Jewish family until the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. Learning that those buried there valued Hebrew scripture and wore it as jewelry helped me feel so connected to them. They wanted God's blessing on their lives, but dark times were just ahead for Jerusalem. Why did the Babylonians attack Jerusalem?
So after King Solomon dies, we know the kingdom splits into 2 kingdoms, Israel in the north, the 10 tribes, and Judah in the south with Jerusalem as its capital. And they fight amongst themselves, these 2 kingdoms. But not only that, the great empires to the east and the north, which is Mesopotamia at that time, Babylon later in history, first Assyria, then Babylon, then Persia, reemerge as superpowers in the north, and Egypt reemerges in the south, and Israel is kind of sandwiched in the middle. So Israel becomes a vassal state, primarily of different Mesopotamian empires, meaning they're paying taxes to them, and they basically, both the northern and southern kingdoms at different periods of time will both rebel against that relationship. And first the northern kingdom, then the southern kingdom will be besieged, destroyed, and the populations exiled.
What do we know about how they attacked Jerusalem?
So the king is King Zedekiah. Jeremiah the prophet is warning, don't rebel, submit. But Zedekiah rebels. The Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor, sends his general, Nebuzaradan, and they surround the city of Jerusalem, and they lay siege to it for over 2.5 years.
Oh, wow.
And during that time, if you read the book of Lamentations, which is Eicha in Hebrew, Jeremiah is prophetically describing what's going to happen in the city. Famine breaking out, cannibalism, horrible stuff, and that's exactly what does happen. And after a very protracted siege, eventually the Babylonians will breach the walls of the city, pour into the city, destroy the temple, and that population that survived, whether it be the starvation or the actual fighting, is then carried away into exile.
Don't go away. We'll be right back.
In response to the unimaginably evil and inhumane attack Hamas inflicted on the nation of Israel and the war such atrocities have made, First Century Foundations remains fully committed to standing with Israel and supporting her specific needs in this desperate hour. Our special Emergency Response for Israel War Fund is now in place, with 90% of all donations going directly to providing food, water, supplies, and shelter for displaced families, trauma support and care for those who are grieving and have witnessed atrocities, toys for children in bomb shelters, and critical supplies and equipment desperately needed. Thanks to our key partners across the land of Israel, First Century Foundations will channel your donations directly to where Israel needs it most right now. Now is the time to show Israel you care. Now is the time to stand with Israel. Please give generously.
I simply cannot conceive how heartbreaking and terrible it would have been for the inhabitants of Jerusalem when the brutal armies of Babylon broke through the gates, destroyed the city where God placed his name, and burned the Temple of Solomon to the ground. So I met up with Isaac in the city of David to see evidence of this unimaginably devastating time in Jerusalem's history.
So this afternoon, we are going to talk about the end of the time of the first temple, Babylonians occupation, 586-87 BC, and Babylonians destruction.
Okay, and what are we looking at here? What do we know about this?
So, this area that we see here is known as Area G. Area G, during the time of the first temple, this was the upper part of Jerusalem. So over here, we're talking about a neighborhood that 3,000 years ago belonged to very rich people. And this neighborhood was built by the foot of the palace of King David. You see the ruins up there, these are the ruins of King David's palace.
Right, right. Now, you're saying all of that, but how do we know? What evidence do we have that this is from the Babylonian era?
Very good question. During the time of the excavations, you see this room over here?
Yep.
All of this room was found buried under layers of layers of layers of ashes. And when archaeologists found the ashes here, they took samples of the ashes to laboratories to carbonate it with C14 to find out what is the exact age of the ashes. The results of all laboratories said 586-87 BC. And this is exactly the time of the Babylonians occupation, exactly the time of the Babylonians destruction. Therefore, the name that was given to this room was the burnt room.
The burnt room, okay. Now, who would have lived here?
Very rich people. And how do we know that? It's very simple. During the time of the excavations over here, archaeologists discovered the remains of burnt wooden furnitures. And the type of the wood that they found here is a type of a wood that you cannot find in Israel. You can find it only in Syria, which means in those days it would cost you a fortune to import wood from Syria to use it for wooden furnitures. And all of the remains of the furnitures that were found here, burnt wooden furnitures, Syrian type of wood.
Okay.
So this is how we come to the conclusion that very rich people lived here.
So we have rich people living in a room that was burnt right at the time of the Babylonian exile. Is there any other evidence of the Babylonian time period here?
Absolutely, yes. Further down, in the lower part of this complex, we discovered a lot of burnt bullas. Now, what is bulla? In those days, if you were very rich or very famous or very important, you would make your own stamp. Now, the stamp, you make it from clay, and on the stamp, or you write down your name, or you would make your own logo. Now, why do you need a bulla? In order to seal documents. Remember, in those days, yet no paper. So during the time of the first temple, we are talking about papyruses. So imagine to yourself that you make a document written up on a papyrus, and now we want to seal it. What do? We will roll it, and then in order to seal it, we will need some wet wax, and then you will put your stamp, you will put your bulla over there. This is how you seal it. Now, during the time of the excavations down here, we discovered the remains of many burnt bullas. This is why many of the archaeologists came to the conclusion that maybe the room down there functioned as an archive, like a library with lots of sealed papyruses. The fire burnt the papyruses, but only thing that was left, these are the burnt seals.
The bulla would have been done in wet clay, not wax,
Yes,
because it wouldn't have lasted.
exactly.
So wax, I guess, was used in the more modern era, other parts of the world
Yes, later on.
later on.
But in order to seal it, again, you put the wet wax, and while the wax is wet, then you will put your stamp in it
And that's
with
the
your
bulla
name.
sticks to it.
This is how the bulla sticks to it. In matter of fact, the fire helped to preserve these bullas because the bullas were made out of clay. So the clay was baked. But again, all of the bullas that were found here were found burnt.
Wow.
This is why many of the archaeologists came to the conclusion perhaps we are talking about an archive.
Let me ask you, any other evidence of the siege, the Babylonian siege that happened in order to bring this era of Jerusalem to an end?
Definitely, yes. In this area, archaeologists discovered a lot of Babylonians' arrowheads.
Okay.
And again, we are talking about tens of arrowheads. All of them go back in time, 586-87 BC, Babylonians' occupation. Remember, when the Babylonians occupied Jerusalem, we are talking about act of a war. Arrowheads, and at the end, final destruction, as we said, was by fire.
Fascinating. It has been difficult to focus on such a dark time in Jerusalem's history, a time when her walls were completely broken down and God's chosen city was burned to the ground. But this tragic event was not the end of Jerusalem's story. The Jewish people that were taken away captive would ever feel the divine pull to return to Zion, to Jerusalem, even as they settled by the rivers of Babylon. And Jerusalem's children would once again return to her. Thank you so much for joining me today. Please join me again next time, right here in God's holy city, as we continue our quest to discover Jerusalem from Genesis to Jesus.